Welcome to the next module in the course. In this module, we'll be talking about some examples of common patterns that can be applied to concurrent and network software. And we're going to choose the patterns to cover from some of the classic pattern literature. In particular, we're going to be covering two patterns from the Design Patterns, Elements of Reusable Object-Oriented Software book, the so-called Gang of Four book, or GoF book. And we'll also talk about two patterns from the Pattern-Oriented Software Architecture, a Systems of Patterns book, also known as the POSA 1 book. Let's briefly talk about the history of these books. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, a PhD student at the University of Zurich named Eric Gamma wrote or co-wrote a graphical user interface framework called ET++, written in C++. And as part of his dissertation, he documented some of the key design elements in his ET++ software in the form of patterns. Around that time, he and his colleagues had been going to various conferences like OOPSLA and eCoop, and they had met up and compared notes. His colleagues had also been developing object-oriented graphical user interface frameworks. For example, John Vlasides had worked on a project called Interviews, and he designed many parts of that. Another colleague, Ralph Johnson, had a long history of working in Smalltalk and doing various user interface frameworks for Smalltalk. And another colleague, Richard Helm, had been doing work at various places also with user interfaces. And so they sat down, compared notes, and wrote a paper that appeared in 1993 in eCoop, documenting some of the ideas that they had had on patterns. Well, that paper was a big hit, and so they also began to work on a book. And that book was later to be published in the 1994 timeframe as the Gang of Four book. Right before the book was published, there was a conference held in Allerton Park, Illinois, that was called the Pattern Languages of Programs Conference, PLOP. And this was shortly before the Gang of Four book came out, but there were still many of the people who were doing work in software design, object-oriented design and programming attended that conference. I happened to be one of the attendees. I had also been a reviewer for the Gang of Four book. And so there was beginning to be an awareness that patterns were growing as a field of study. Some of the other participants in the first PLOP conference were a group from Siemens in Munich, Germany. They were working on a book which was later to be published in a couple years down the road called Pattern-Oriented Software Architecture, Volume 1, A System of Patterns. That's the POSA 1 book. The Gang of Four and POSA authors spent years selecting design practices from their experience that could be recast as patterns, distilling the presentations of those patterns, going to conferences like the PLOP conference, having their patterns reviewed in what's called a writer's workshop form, which we'll talk about later, which is actually something that has come from the poetry and writers community, where people will critique a document, giving the authors feedback on what they got from the document, things they liked, areas for improvement, and so on. And through this successive process of iteration and incremental improvement, culled out the descriptions they deemed immature and focused on the ones that became part of the published work. Let's take a quick look at the patterns that appear in the Gang of Four book. There's 23 patterns in the book, and they're organized in a couple of different ways. They're divided in terms of their scope, whether they apply to classes and class relationships or objects, and they also differ according to their purpose, which reflects what the pattern is predominantly oriented towards. One of the purpose areas is creational patterns, which abstract the process of instantiating objects. There's also another purpose category called structural patterns, which describe how classes and objects can be confined and combined to form larger structures. And then the final purpose area is called behavioral patterns, which are concerned with communication between objects. Now, keep in mind that some of these distinctions are a little bit arbitrary. Whether something's behavioral or structural is a bit of a matter of interpretation. And you'll also notice that there's some things that are just missing from this taxonomy. For example, there's a whole set of patterns for creating objects, but in the original Gang of Four book, there were no patterns for disposing of them. This, of course, would be added later in other literature that came beyond the Gang of Four book. There are many patterns in the Gang of Four book. We're just going to focus on two of them in our intro. We're going to talk about proxy, and we're going to talk about observer. It's interesting to note that even though most of the patterns in the Gang of Four book don't focus on concurrency and networking per se, in other words, you don't see a lot of description of the forces of race conditions and deadlock and causal ordering and other kinds of things you might run into in an actual concurrent and networked environment, that when people implement concurrent and networked software, they tend to apply many of the Gang of Four patterns to make their designs more flexible and extensible. So keep that in mind, because as we talk through other patterns later in the book, you'll see how many of the Gang of Four patterns can be applied in conjunction with those patterns. Once again, underscoring the fact that patterns rarely exist in isolation, but instead form societies of patterns, pattern sequences, pattern languages, and so on. The design space for the POSA 1 book is a little different. It's broken up a little bit differently. Instead of focusing on purpose or scope, they focused on whether the pattern was viewed to be architectural in nature or more design-oriented in nature. And of the 16 or so patterns in the book, they roughly break down about half and half. Architectural patterns are defined as expressing fundamental structural organization schemes for software systems. The basic idea here is if you understand the architecture and you get the architecture patterns defined correctly, it's more likely your system will be able to evolve and deal with change than if you get those things wrong. Design patterns are defined as a way to provide a scheme for refining components of a software system or the relationships between those components. The idea here is that in some sense the design patterns are perhaps a bit less strategic than the architectural patterns. They're a bit more tactical in focus. There's design trade-offs that are a bit more microscopic in scope, and you conceivably could maybe get some of the design patterns wrong, still have things work. If you get the architecture patterns wrong, you're in for a world of hurt over the life cycle trying to evolve and maintain the code. There's lots more material about the POSA books that appear on my website because I was an author of some of the subsequent books in this series. The particular patterns we're going to talk about from the POSA 1 book in this intro are broker and command processor. It's also worth noting that the proxy pattern also appears in the POSA 1 book. So it's an example of a pattern that was documented both in the Gang of Four book and in the POSA 1 book. Basically the same pattern, just different authors describing it from their perspectives and emphasizing things that were most important to them and the types of systems that they were developing at the time. Many of the POSA 1 patterns are highly relevant for concurrent and network software. And we're going to talk about a lot of these things throughout the course. We'll be talking about publisher-subscriber, which is somewhat of a variant or an augmentation to observer. We'll be talking about layers. We'll be talking about pipes and filters and so on. And these are patterns that are widely used in distributed systems, fault-tolerant systems, multi-tier architecture systems, systems for business processing, transaction processing, real-time distributed embedded systems processing, and so on. So you'll see that a lot of the patterns that are in the POSA 1 book will be very relevant for our discussions. But in our intro, we're just going to focus on a couple of them. So to summarize, these books focus on a couple of the core foundational areas in pattern literature. They're what are commonly known as pattern collections, and that's because they tend to emphasize the patterns in isolation as opposed to focusing extensively on the interactions between the patterns. There are, of course, some diagrams in the books that show ways in which the patterns can interact. And in the various see also portions of the pattern form, you'll see references to other patterns. But the bulk of the page count in the book is not focused on the interactions between the patterns. It's focused on describing the patterns themselves in 20 to 30 pages worth of text. In some sense, these standalone patterns documented in pattern collections are a bit like vocabulary words that you might come across as you're learning a new human language. And of course, you realize that as you learn a new language, or even as you learn to speak your original language, learning and mastering those vocabulary words are essential to being able to convey almost anything. But that's necessary, not sufficient, in order to be able to be an articulate speaker, in order to be able to be persuasive, in order to be able to convey more complex sets of knowledge. So the patterns are the building blocks, but what's really important over time are the ways those patterns get knitted together to form pattern languages, pattern sequences. And these pattern languages and pattern sequences are going to be the focus of later parts of the course, because that's the way that most people come across patterns in practice. They don't come across them in onesie-twosies in isolation. They work together as broader groups. So we'll get to that part later, but for now, let's turn our attention to discussing some specific examples of POSA 1 and Gang of 4 patterns in the context of concurrent and networked software.